yes, as Beth said, I've had the privilege of working with her on a number of different projects, and I put some of them on the screen here, which reports, summaries, and books available from many of our studies. These are three that I'm particularly going to be drawing from in this talk today, because they're ones which amplify the voices of adopted people, and they're the ones we really want to hear about. So we carried out life story interviews quite recently with adult adoptees who had become parents themselves, and we were interested to see how that affected them. We also carried out a survey of many adult adopted people as well, with PAT UK, asking them about what they felt about this idea of maintaining relationships with their families after adoption, what they felt was important for people to know about that. And also something we're proud of is our longitudinal study, where we spoke to the adults who were affected by adoption, but also we interviewed children at two different stages as well, middle childhood and later in early adulthood or late adolescence. So there's some of the examples of studies that I'll be referring to. We've carried out many others as well that we'll be drawing from in future webinars. Also, of course, there's a bulk of research done by many other people as well that is important to think about, and sometimes I'll be drawing a bit on these different findings as well. So many different books, many different studies that are out there. It's great that we are hearing from adopted people now, hearing about how it affects them through their later life, because although adoption primarily takes place when children are young, they're usually under 5, and we tend to focus on their immediate needs at that stage, making sure they feel safe and secure, settled into their new family, develop a secure base. But we mustn't lose focus on the fact that this child is going to grow up. They're going to become an independent, thinking adult, and other needs connected to their adoption are going to come to the fore, and their whole lifetime experience may be impacted by the decisions we make at the very early stage. Everything we do can have a long time effect. The Adoption and Children's Act 2002 says that we must be thinking about the child's welfare throughout their whole life. So it's really important that we are really listening to people at different ages. And now that we do have a bulk of research from these voices, we have no excuse not to take it into account. Although having said that, yes, we do have a lot of research, but there are still gaps in our knowledge. One thing that Beth and I talked about recently was that we don't know enough about adopted adults later in life, when they get into their 60s, 70s and 80s. And that's a whole area that I'd like to hear more about. Maybe that would be a topic of future study. But this is the focus of this talk, is about how adoption experiences, how adoption is experienced throughout people's lifetime, and something that I'm going to be referring to particularly is people's identity needs, because that's a key part of our development as humans. It really encompasses lots of different parts of how we see ourselves, how we present ourselves, how we think about ourselves with other people as well. It's all about understanding ourselves, and is strongly related to things like self-esteem as well, well-being, how we feel about ourselves in comparison to other people. And in the world, it has overlaps with things like attachments. How do we feel about ourselves in relation to our carers, our parents? Do we feel loved? Do we have a secure base? Do we feel confident enough to go out and explore? And psychologists have started referring to identity as a narrative, as like a sort of a life story that we tell ourselves, because we're storytelling people. We talk to each other in terms of stories. We create stories about ourselves. Having stories enables us to integrate and understand our experiences, help them to make sense to ourselves and make sense to other people. As we talk about ourselves to other people, we seek stories that are understandable and meaningful. The tone of these stories can vary. Sometimes our stories about ourselves are positive, sometimes they're more negative, or they might have optimistic tones or pessimistic tones. They could be stories of agency, overcoming adversity, or hope or despair. But the important thing about these stories is that they're socially constructed. We talk about ourselves with other people, and listeners feed back to us. They help co-create these stories, shape the meaning of these stories. And the language and the culture that we're in influences those stories as well. The words we use when we talk about ourselves and talk about others. And the power of language is becoming something that we are particularly concerned about when we talk, for example, of children in care. We've become aware of how our words, such as looked after children with its acronym LAC, and our use of words such as placement and respite can have negative connotations, can give this sense of people being objects that are placed into different settings, not children in families. So I know that a lot of you are very aware of language and the power that it has, and it's really important that we are aware of how that feeds into our identity. The other thing that's really important to know about identity is that it's a lifelong process. We've tended to think of it as being really important to adolescence, and it's true, it does come to the fore at adolescence. That's when our identity kind of gets unplugged as we start to find our own sense of identity as an adult, an independent adult. But it actually is affected at all different things that happen throughout our life. All life events that we have will impact on us, whether it's the birth of a sibling, starting school, divorce, going through education, new relationships in the future, having children. All of this can impact how we feel about ourselves, how we see ourselves. So it's a lifelong process and is strongly related to also well-being. Many psychologists have found a link between identity and well-being. We have a coherent sense of who we are, a strong commitment to who we are, then that's linked to many positive characteristics such as lower depression, high self-esteem, recovery from trauma. So this is why it's a big topic. This is why it's been studied, and people are particularly interested in how we can develop a coherent sense of ourselves, because that's so strongly linked to well-being. And we know that talking about ourselves is related to coherence. Voicing it, hearing other people reflect on our stories. We tend to talk about ourselves a lot with our friends, people in our family, particularly people who know us from throughout our life, who have stories to tell about ourselves. And I wanted to share with you this example that actually came from my recent research that I've been doing with teenagers who've been raised with a special guardian, so not adoption. They've lived within their extended family after child protection intervention. And this is a young boy talking about some of the stories that his family tells about his upbringing. So he talks about his family, his birth family being football mad. He says, my birth mum is football mad, and she used to tell me when I used to go and see her about the time that she knew I was going to be a footballer, because she used to hate how I kicked her hard in the stomach, so she knew I was going to be a footballer. He also talks about a nan. He lives with a step gran as his special guardian. This is a different nan who he also has regular contact with. And he says, she loves telling me a story when she's drunk. She's like grabbed onto my little finger when I was in the incubator. He had health problems when he was born. He was struggling for life. And when he was in the incubator, she grabbed his little finger and said, your surname is Knight. She's like, you're a knight. You girls are known for fighting. You can fight through this, stuff like that. Everyone left the room, and 5 minutes later, I started breathing on my own again, so I didn't need the machine. I think since then, my mum was I think she'll always feel like my mum, and I will always feel like her son, because she doesn't ever want to lose me again. This is a significant story of his life. Obviously, it's one he can't remember, but it's something that's recalled, it's talked about. Whether it happened exactly like that, we'll never know, but this has become a story of the family, and a story of them being fighters, being good at overcoming things. A positive story, and I think you can get a sense of how it links to his self-esteem, of feeling good about himself, feeling loved in his family, feeling strong. A story of being a fighter is very strong for him. And as I've been interviewing these young people and hearing their stories that they know about their life, they know so many people in their birth family. I've become aware of how many people that I spoke to who are adopted who didn't have these kind of stories to talk about their early life. They had gaps. And this is a little piece of an interview from our recent interviews with adopted adults who've become parents. And this woman is now in her 30s. She's been through quite a journey with her adoption. She was neglected by her birth family and adopted by her foster carers age 4. And what she talks about that is, as far as adopted mum is concerned, I'm hers. And that means nobody else needs to know I'm adopted. And I think they were quite horrified by me wanting to access my records, which she did when she was 18. They were upset. It's not something we talk about at all. As a teenager, there was a lot of negative emotions. She went through a time where she was idolizing her birth mother at this time, really wanting to know who my birth mother was, feeling at odds with her adoptive parents, feeling that she has to be better than these. And in hindsight, now we're speaking to her in her 30s, she said, actually, they're the best family I could have been adopted by. So she's been through quite a journey. She did go and meet with her birth parents. She didn't keep in touch with them in later life. Now she's in her 30s. She's met the love of her life. She's become a parent, and she's got quite a transformed identity. Her identity as a parent is the strongest dominant identity now. But she's also made it up with her adoptive parents as well. And looking back, she can see actually they were good parents. They weren't very good with teenagers, but they were actually very good parents. So now she can see the reality of who her birth parents are. She's got more of a sense that as an adult looking back, she's got a better sense of who she is. But she did go through this difficult time, not knowing her past, it not being talked about, and fantasizing about this birth parent who she felt had to be better than the adoptive parents who she was with. Many of the young people I've been interviewing for my special guardianship study who do see their parents, many of them have lots of problems, suffering from addiction or mental health issues. They do have their sense who their birth parents are. And it's been interesting to contrast those stories that they have with those who have the gaps and are left to fantasy or wondering or thinking. So, of course, adoption also brings about many positive things. It brings about positive stories with being in a family of love and belonging, safety and recovery. And we hear about many people who talk about how they were really close to their adopters. We've got lots of shared memories. Sharing positive memories together is really important for well-being. People talk about how being adopted set them up for the rest of their life. But we're going to focus more on the issues today because that's what we need to face up to and work through. And we're going to hear from Claire now, and also from a bulk of research we've done, which shows some of the struggles that people have with their adoption too, not knowing who they are, what is the real you, feeling that they've arrived as a blank slate, not knowing their history, their family tree. So I think we're going over to Claire now.
Thanks, Julie. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks, Beth, for the introduction earlier. Yes, that's correct. The blog howtobeadopted.com has been going. We'll turn 6 next week. So if you haven't had a look, please do check it out. It's howtobeadopted.com. Next slide, please, Julie. And yeah, we get some really positive comments from adoptees who stumble across the blog. And that's what I wanted, because I set it up when I was looking for information out there and I couldn't find anything. So it's really lovely that people are finding it, people in the same shoes that I was in 6 years ago. We're also on Twitter and Instagram. So that's at howtobeadopted if you'd like to give us a follow or recommend us to any adoptees that you know. And some of you may have seen I was featured in The Guardian this time last year. So that was great because it got a lot more adopted people coming to the site. And yeah, I heard that it really helped a lot of people. And I even had a couple of people I used to work with, someone I went to school with, kind of people, popping up. So that was really lovely. It was quite a scary thing to do, but to hear that it helped people did make it worth it. Thanks, Julie. So just to kind of sum up my credentials, kind of why I'm here today, we've had 78,000 visitors to the website, 4,000 and 2,000 followers socially. I've been a keynote speaker for PAC UK and One Adoption. There's a nice quote there from Sarah Jo Howe, who said, you were brilliant at the conference. We had some great feedback from just about everyone present. So Thank you, Sarah, for that. And yeah, so in terms of my kind of credentials, I'm a domestic adoptee from the closed era, but I also am an aunt. My nieces are adopted and in kinship care. So I was initially offered letterbox contact with them, and that has evolved to direct contact. So I have experience of the contemporary side of adoption as well. So this slide, what I want everyone to do is close your eyes. If you don't feel comfortable closing your eyes, you can just kind of just rest your gaze downwards rather than reading on ahead on the slide. So just closing your eyes and just thinking if any of these things, these questions resonate with you. Who do you share your eye colour with? Can you confidently answer the question, where are you from? Did one of your great-grandparents fight in the war? Was English the first language you heard spoken around you? Were you named after an aunt, uncle, or grandparent? Does cancer, heart disease, or mental health run in your family? Do you know how long your mother was in labour for? Do you share a high IQ with a parent? Do you know how your mum and dad met? Are you left-handed like a parent? Are you part of a religion that passes down the generations, like Judaism? Do your children laugh or dance in the same way as a relative? Do you have an accent? Is your family musical, sporty? Are you tall like your cousins? Did your ancestors migrate to avoid persecution or famine? Is there a family recipe that's been passed down the generations? Did your grandfather lose his hair prematurely? Okay, so I don't know how many of those questions resonated, but the estimate is that for people who grew up in their family of origins, around 50 to 70% of those questions would resonate. However, for adopted people, next slide, please, Julie. We don't know this stuff, so majority of us don't know any of that stuff. Obviously, it varies for everybody, but most of us don't know the answers to those questions. And what I find even worse than that is that we've been told that it doesn't matter. So in the ways that we get told things like, well, we're your family now. Love is all you need. And we also get told variations on your first family couldn't look after you properly anyway. And that varies according to the generation. So it might be for us older adoptees that our mothers weren't able. And for, later, more recent adoptions, it could be even more kind of negative sentiment about first families. So all of that gives us the message that it doesn't matter. But I would argue that, and I know Julie would too, that a sense of identity is a lifelong need. And you can see here I am with my amazing cowlick I don't know why my mum gave me a fringe, but basically, yeah, it wasn't until I was kind of 26 that I found out where my cowlick comes from. And now that I'm a mum, I've passed the cowlick down to my son, so she's very grateful for. And also my sister there next to me. So she was adopted from a different family into our family, and like her children were bald probably for about the first 2 years of their lives as well. So it's all these little things that go to building up our identity, even just our hair. So I've tried to break it down. So there's just so much to cover, but I tried to kind of group for me into the kind of phases that I've been through as an adoptee in terms of my sense of identity. So we'll go to phase 1, where I kind of is the kind of going along with it kind of phase, where I personally was kind of complying with and even agreeing with this whole "it doesn't matter" message. So I did have a clear sense of identity on the surface, But I think what I was doing was kind of gripping on with these white knuckles, like really, like almost like a survival trauma like identity, where I was highly gripping to the identity of my adoptive parents and my adoptive family, which I do have compassion for myself, because when you think about it, there was no choice really other than to grip on to that, because I didn't have anything else to go on. So that was kind of how I remember childhood. And here I am again with my sister, and you can see that the cowlick is still there, but my sister did eventually grow some hair, bless her. So I did have one quite strong identity when I was a teenager, which was that I was a Take That fan, and thank goodness there is no photographic evidence of me as a Take That fan. These are just stock images. But actually, I know that there was a lot of kind of Take That fans around, but I really do think that I kind of really latched on to the point that people at school were asking me if I was going to call the helpline when Take That split up, and it's just an example. I feel I wanted to give you an example of the different things that I've kind of latched onto throughout my life that have almost been kind of I would say obsessions, but kind of, if you know me, you'll know that there's kind of half a dozen really strong things about me that I kind of have gone through phases. So this is probably my first main phase. And also around this time, so this is in my 20s, I wrote this piece under a pseudonym for the Be My Parent magazine, which was run by BAF. So I was actually working at BAF. So when I say that I was kind of going along with the "it doesn't matter" message, to the point that I was actually working at the British Association for Adoption and Fostering in the family finding team, and actually like helping to write information for the marketing, basically saying things like, my adoptive family made me who I am, and it doesn't matter about my birth family. So that's just to show you that throughout the life cycle we can kind of move and evolve. And I'm just sharing that kind of moment of vulnerability with you guys, that to show you how I was so wedded to not needing to have any other identity apart from my adoptive family that I'm even sort of writing articles about it. Thank you, Julie. So then phase 2 I've described as when the penny drops, and you kind of think, well, hold on a minute, this stuff that I've been told doesn't matter. It matters. It seems to matter to everybody else, and you suddenly start noticing it everywhere. So people getting these DNA kits for Christmas presents, and like, oh, a bit of fun, going to find out, some of my genetic, history. You've got the family tree, the kind of dreaded family tree projects at school. And it all kind of builds a picture. So I was once sat on a plane next to somebody who told me that she'd just been out to Jamaica because she wanted to see a house that her grandparent had owned or had lived in the past. And we got talking, we got chatting, and I mentioned that I was adopted and I was looking at finding my birth family. And she got really cross with me and said, well, how dare you do that? How dare you do that to your adoptive parents? And I thought to myself, hold on a minute, you've just told me that you're traveling to Jamaica to track down this kind of place that means something to your family. So that's your heritage. So I'm not allowed to look into my heritage, but you're allowed to look into your heritage. And that's around the time that this, penny started dropping. And I just want to underline the point. So think of a number in your head, just have a little guess, because the chat's not working. So have a guess. If it doesn't matter, how much do you think the company Ancestry is valued at? I'll get Julie to do a reveal. Yeah, so it's nearly a $5 billion dollar company. So yeah, then phase 3, I start to think, well, hang on a minute. Actually, this stuff does matter to me. And this is a really difficult phase because some of us have to really sort of feel like we have to tiptoe around or keep things to ourselves, or we're not sure who is a safe kind of person to talk to. So for me, when this realization hit, I was in my early 30s, and I know it can vary, but I have met with a lot of adoptees since I started the blog, and it is generally does tend to be around the 30s and or when we become parents. And I started to think, well, I don't know these things. So it's one thing for me not to know these things, but my kids don't know these things either. And so now there's an impact on their identity too. And it almost kind of fired me up. So here I am at this stage. So this is with my son, and you can see my daughter's very nearly about to join us. And this is when I started to, really struggle with mental health, and I link it to all of this stuff around adoption and identity and not having dealt with it before. So some people call it coming out of the fog. So I had this kind of identity crisis in my early to mid 30s. There was a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. I was withdrawing from friends who weren't adopted, and in that there was a big gap in my life, needing to seek other adopted people to talk about these things with. And there were challenges with parenting, because this is all coming at the time when I've got these two tiny dependents, and yet I'm going through all of this stuff internally, and there's no support. So the GP did diagnose me with postnatal depression, but I'm wondering if there's kind of like a subcategory that is unique to adopted people, or people who haven't grown up with their biological family, because it definitely didn't, there's definitely nuances that weren't in any way examined or looked at all by the GP. No therapy was suggested. It was literally just, here's a prescription for the cheapest antidepressant and off you go. Not even question around, if it's going to affect breastfeeding, anything, just off you go kind of thing. And I did write about this. I was interviewed in Grazia magazine about this period of my life. So again, contacted by a lot of adopted people following this to kind of say thank you for sharing, and that they'd had similar experiences and didn't feel they had anyone to kind of talk to. And I think most of us on the webinar will know there's like quite a big lack of support out there generally, and this is just one life stage for me that really hit home. And I really wanted to include this quote from Julie Bruce, who's part of the team at How to Be Adopted. So if you want to read the whole thing, you can go to the website. It's called Finding the Pieces. And Julie here talks about, as an adoptee, I felt like a hodgepodge of pieces. Many pieces were missing, some were broken, and some were from the wrong box altogether. I wanted to know whose nose I have, whose genes gave me this unruly hair, whose sense of rhythm has me up on the dance floor at the first opportunity, whose love of colour draws me to art and design, and who's to blame for my weird digestive system that makes me need to eat painfully slowly. None of these aspects were from my adoptive family. So this is one of the most popular pieces on the blog. So yeah, so do check it out if you have time. So phase 4, I've called the kind of gathering crumbs phase, where we've realised that this stuff does matter. So then we're kind of spurred into action to try and find out as much as we can. So all I knew before I was 18, because remember I'm from the closed era, we think your birth father might have been Irish, and your birth mother was small like you with dark hair. And I think she worked as an office clerk. So that was it. I didn't even have a name for my birth mother. I didn't even know if my name was changed, anything. And then I went to get my files at 18. And I wrote about this for the PAC website. So you're welcome to go and have a look at that. So that's me at 18. And I just wrote all about finding my files, which actually I found out is actually really early, 18. So I didn't realise that some people don't search till quite a lot later. So unfortunately, I found out that my birth mother was also adopted. So this was kind of a little bit of a dead end in terms of so then I found her, but I didn't find any other kind of history from her. And I know that does affect a lot of people who find who find a dead end, and transracial and international adoptees can be more disproportionately affected by not finding records, records being destroyed, records being redacted, that kind of thing. So I know that Julie and Beth are going to cover some of the issues around the kind of transracial and international side in later webinars, so make sure you sign up for those. So yeah, in terms of crumbs, a lot of us actually go onto these kind of ancestry websites, and for some people who aren't adopted, it can feel like a bit of fun, but for us it's actually it can be really traumatic and just absolutely devastating to feel like we have to like spit into a tube, send it off in the post, and it's not even sell our information, it's pay them to take our information and to take our data, and we don't necessarily want to have to do this, but many of us feel that we don't have a choice. And here you can see that it was correct, the rumours were true. So my birth father is Irish, I am half Irish, which is confirmed here with my DNA test. So of course, what did I immediately do? Is I immediately went on to the next slide. Yeah, so I found out that I'm from this really beautiful, my ancestors are from this really beautiful part of Ireland called Wicklow. So I immediately went out and, you know, covered myself in head to toe in shamrocks and got myself a pint of Guinness, went to try and, you know, celebrate St. Patrick's Day. But unfortunately, I was told by some Irish friends that, no, you're not really Irish. Not really Irish. You're just jumping on the bandwagon. And I think that, again, that's what a lot of people with kind of the transracial, the international element find, that they don't feel like they belong on either side. So yeah, I'm really pleased that's going to be covered in later webinars. And I can't talk about DNA without mentioning my dear friend Tim, who was searching for 77 years for any piece of information at all about his identity. And finally, we persuaded him to do a DNA test because he'd exhausted all avenues. And at 77, he found his sister, Roxy. She was living in Canada. So thank goodness she got to come over before the pandemic and they got to meet. And everybody who knows Tim has said that he is walking differently since he met Roxy. It's like a weight's been lifted and he's just so much lighter in himself. And I'm really proud of him because he really did not want to do that test. So yeah, so I feel like the previous phase, it's kind of like an action phase, and we're really kind of activated, and we're, you know, busy collecting all these clues, trying all these avenues. But then phase 5 is when the grief hits, and we realise that there are things that we'll never know, and then also the things that we now do know. There's all those years that we've lost, that we didn't know any of that information about ourselves and about our heritage, and we couldn't use that to build our identity, and it's sort of grieving for all that lost time. And this is a really tough phase, and it has a lot of effects on mental health. So majority of people that I meet through my events are in this, roughly around this phase, and they're starting to experience feelings of shame, feelings of loneliness. I don't know where the slides have gone, but I'll keep going. Disconnection from adoptive family, disconnection from friends, colleagues, and feelings of rage, which is really common if you've had a lot of suppressed feelings throughout your life, and a dysregulated nervous system. A lot of us are struggling with. And there's a quote here from Brené Brown, who says, I define shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. So logically, we know that the shame that we feel isn't our shame to carry, and it's a lot of kind of baggage on us from society, adoptive parents, birth families, but nevertheless, it is something that we do, like majority of us I've met have felt. So as you can tell, this is quite a difficult thing to be going through. You've got other things going on in your life. So things that have helped, community, which is why I set up, this is the North London group that I set up. Access to therapy would be great. Anyone who, you know, has any say in these things. We've got the Ofsted ruling is hopefully going to change soon, so there'll be more access to therapy, but it is something that is really lacking. And just, yeah, I feel like what we need to understand is that adult adoptees are not a separate, we're not a separate category. So helping us is future planning for the, if you help adult adoptees, that's future planning for the younger adoptees now who are coming up. So that will, all that stuff will be in place for them in the future. So it's a double whammy, why it's needed. And then phase 6, yeah, as you can tell, touch wood, I don't think I'm at the end of my life yet, so I've still got another phase. Who knows? A lot of people say like 50s, 60s. There's a lot of identity things coming up around like losing parents and stuff, but all that to come. So here I am now with my lovely, wonderful family, and yeah, just sort of hoping to help others, really. So finally, yeah, how you can help. If you can support adoptee-led organisations, help us lobby for more support for adopted people, and yeah, finally just understand how much identity does matter. Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Claire. That was incredibly powerful. Thank you for sharing your very personal journey with us. I almost feel like it stopped there. It feels like there's hardly anything else to say, except I do want to do justice to, you know, the many, many people that have taken part in our research as well, and just picking up on some of the themes again, which you've shared. It's a very, you know, what you've gone through is, we know from research, is very common. And yet also it's very unique. But what is clear is that the journey through identity isn't a big, wide, flat motorway, is it? You showed how it's more like a roller coaster of sharp turns and sharp drops and highs and lows and dead ends, sadly, as well. So yeah, lots of themes that you've raised that I've sort of collected together on this slide here, and I'm going to pick up on some of that in as I race through the last few slides that we have. So it's pretty clear how, yes, it's a lifelong journey through adoption because of so many different experiences that we have because of different life events. But also a lot of our journey through identity happens even when we're very young and our world can be quite stable. We can be within our family and things can be quite stable, but our brain is developing quite rapidly and reassessing, reevaluating our adoption story constantly. And I think we had a really nice little glimpse into that when we interviewed young children in our longitudinal study. Some of the really young children, like 5 years old or below, they often use the language of adoption without really understanding it. But it's when you hit middle childhood that research shows that's quite a lot happens in that sort of 5 to 12 age bracket, where you're really starting to develop an understanding. You've got logical thinking, you're starting to develop abstract thinking, starting to see things differently, and that can cause a lot of stress as we start to reassess our adoption story. And researchers have found that sometimes the simple story that we were very happy with when we were young, like your mum was ill or your dad wasn't around when you were young, you know, as our brain develops, we start thinking of that in different ways and start realizing that perhaps our parents had options, perhaps they could have done things. They start to understand that most children live with their biological parents. Biological parents would do anything. They would lay down their life for their children. So what is it about your parents that didn't happen? And that causes a lot of re-evaluating your story, a lot of new questions that start appearing. And then adolescence, of course, moving into this even fuller understanding, developing hypothetical thinking. This, well, what if I lived with my birth parents? What if you hadn't adopted me? Or what if another set of people had adopted me? What if child protection hadn't intervened? So all new questions start appearing then. Sometimes a greater empathy for what it must be like to be someone who's struggling with depression or mental health issues, because you might be going through issues yourself and get a sense of life being difficult because you might experience difficult things. But all this process of developing causes new struggles, often with the meaning of being adopted. It can cause people to wonder what it was about their parents, what it is about them. It can cause feelings of rejection or loss come to fore at lots of different stages. And as Claire highlighted, moving into adulthood, particularly having new relationships, new children, being another time where things are reevaluated. A lot of people talk about when they've suffered bereavement, that makes them wonder about their family members from their biological family, as well as being another time where things are reassessed or thought about in a different way. So in some of our interviews that we did with quite young children, we found that they were, they talked about going through different feelings about their contact or their birth family. This young girl talks about how they had a letter from their birth parent, not really understanding what it was when they were about 4. It was just a letter, didn't really know it was any different to anyone else. But when they were 6, it started making a bit more sense to them. It's from another mum, and they started crying, she said, and my mum had to explain it to me, and I understood it more. Now it feels like okay, I feel excited. So going through these different phases, we found that some children in middle childhood were starting to begin to think more about, well, why didn't my parents fight harder for me? What was it about me that meant that they didn't do something to look after me? Some of our teenagers talked about either adoption coming to the fore and being really important, or they had lots of other things they were dealing with in life that meant they had to put it aside. Exams or peers or relationships. Sometimes they were going through big struggles with life that meant they couldn't take on thinking about their adoption at all. Things were building up too much. It got to too much of a head and became too much to think about. And as Claire pointed out, sometimes having a child, you start to think about the implications of your own adoption, your own heritage, not knowing your medical history, not knowing where things come from. What about your child growing up like that too? Should you think about their life and what they need to know as well? So this journey that Claire illustrated so well. And I think what's really important is that parents need to know about is that all these little leaps in understanding can lead to lots of new questions. They may have been told the story maybe several times when they were young, but because of leaps in understanding, they need to hear it again. They need to go through it again. They need to understand it in a different way. And one of our teens said that they often talk in the car, often a typical place for people to talk. When they're not looking at each other, it feels a bit more relaxed. And they might say things like, what is it my birth mum has? And she'd say schizophrenia. And I'd ask, well, but why couldn't she look after me? Needing to know it again. Why? What really is it about my story? Trying to make sense of it as their thinking changes. What we do know from research is that, unfortunately, many people don't voice these questions. It's something they keep to themselves because they are afraid of upsetting their adoptive parents, afraid of being disloyal. And one little study that I love by Debbie Watson and her team, who talked to children about their life story books, she found that some of those children were saying, I don't like my adoptive parents seeing me look at my book. I tend to just look at it in the middle of the night because I don't want them to know. And this is something very common in research with children, this desire to keep things to themselves where they feel they might be upsetting their parents, feeling disloyal to them, feeling they want to protect them. Adults have also said that as well. It goes through my head every day, like, what if it was different? Always thinking about their birth parents. What if I did have my mum? What if I could see her? Stuff like that. But I don't like to think about it because I feel like I'm letting my adoptive parents down. I think what is really common is that even though adoption takes away the legal connection to the birth parent, it doesn't take away that psychological connection. It is something that people think about. There might be things that stop them thinking about it, whether it's fear or guilt, as Claire talked about, this feeling of you shouldn't think about that, you should think about this, the fresh start. But it is something that is in people's minds. People talk about wanting to know more about their birth parents, not knowing enough, wanting to know if you have things in common with them. Also wondering about siblings you might have out there or cousins, wondering what would have life been like if we'd known each other, feeling the loss, even if you can't remember these people. a loss can still be experienced. One of our adults said, losing my mum, losing her as a parent, losing her from my life because I don't have contact with her, is probably harder for me than knowing my birth dad had died, because knowing she is still out there, knowing that she's living a life, what's that like? We hear about this loss as being not a complete loss, not a loss that can be resolved, because people are still out there. They still may exist. They still are living lives. An ambiguous loss. And also a loss that's disenfranchised, that we can't talk about very well with other people, because, as Claire pointed out, the narratives that people have about adoption, you shouldn't think about it, or because of our fears of upsetting people. Teenagers, children often talk about thinking about it in their sleep, ruminating over things in their mind. How did this happen? How did my dad die? Am I able to get in contact with my mum? And we know from research on identity that being stuck in these thoughts, not being able to reflect on them with other people, not being able to talk about other people and help things to become coherent, has lots of issues with well-being. Fragmented identity is something that is linked to poor well-being, having no idea why you've been adopted, as this young person said, this teenager said, I've never met my birth mum, I just had one picture. It really bothered me when I got to about 10, when the thinking started developing, and I sometimes get really upset, really angry. We know that all those kind of ruminating, those not being able to make sense of a story is linked to poor well-being. And unfortunately, our life story work often is very poor. It's often just a collection of pictures. It doesn't have a narrative. It's often not a story that people can trust as well. We know that poor life story work is linked to people not trusting that they've really got the truth about what happened and feeling unsettled in their families. And we know that having gaps in a story means that sometimes children and people start thinking that maybe their adoption is because of they doing something wrong. Maybe they were too naughty, maybe they cried too much. And this can affect people even into adulthood, as one of our parents said in our later studies. I grew up thinking that I wasn't wanted, and I don't feel I could even be a good enough parent for my son, it impacting deep into their whole identity. Some people feeling scared about what they don't know. Gaps can lead to fears that maybe there's something really terrible about their birth story. Why is it not talked about? Why can I not see my mum? One of the adults we spoke to talked about, I had this vision that I was going to meet my mum and it scared me. I didn't go to sleep for a day, for a night. And another teenager said to us, I think most of my anger was because I didn't know much information about them, the fear of unknowing. Another found that their birth mum had died a few years ago. I felt a huge letdown. How dare she? How dare she die when I've not got the answers? So having gaps can lead to, as Claire said, these dead ends where you just don't have answers. You don't know your story.
Julie, a few more minutes?
Yes, a few more minutes.
Sorry,
yeah.
there's so much to say.
We
It's such a massive topic.
Half an hour. So Claire talked a lot about the stigma, the narratives around adoption. People talking about it's not your real family. If adoption is second best to having your own child. And even in later life, health visitors assuming that you're going to struggle being a mum because you're adopted. Claire talked as well about internalized narratives, the master narratives that people talk about adoption. You should be lucky. You should be grateful. And one of our adopted adults talked about that as well. Be good, keep quiet, don't piss people off. That sums up what it is to be a compliant adoptee, as Claire talked about. And all that goes deep into your identity, your subconscious. You develop these strategies, feeling that you're not good enough. You've got to be grateful for what's happened. Some people feel different to their adopted family. Sometimes that's because they look different, because they might look Chinese, because perhaps their heritage is Chinese, and yet they've been raised in a white family. And in some studies on transracial adoption, we can feel, as Claire said, about you feeling not fitting in either world. In Claire, it was about not being truly Irish, but feeling that part of herself is Irish. And we hear that in the study of women adopted from Hong Kong as well, feeling that they don't fit into either camp. And all this means that trying to work out where you belong can be so much more complicated. And perhaps fantasizing, if you don't know this birth family, fantasizing, well, would I feel I belong better because I don't know them? Perhaps I would match up with them better. Perhaps this family that I'm in isn't the family that's best for me. Being adopted and becoming a parent, Claire talked about how that raised new feelings as well. For some people, it re-traumatizes because they can see the love that their new baby is getting from their partner, as this young person said. It was re-traumatizing. For some, it shocked me that their adoption story came out again. So many new things to talk about. I'm wondering whether the reason why they weren't cared for by their parents might be something genetic. They might be passing that on as well. Some people, it caused them to reassess their birth parents, perhaps understanding what their birth parents have lost. This young father said, it must be so hard to give a child up. I was born and taken away, and I can understand, having become a parent, that when you've seen your newborn, what's that like? You can never forget that instant feeling you have for your own baby, and thinking this new empathy for his mum. For others, it was feeling, well, how could you not fight for your child? I would move any mountain to fight for my child. So reassessing what their birth parents went through, what they were like, having to deal with that new awareness of their adoption, the impact of trauma being huge for adoptees as well. This can affect their memory. They can have blocked memories and disturbed attachments, which can mean trying to get a coherent understanding of themselves is very difficult. This young man talked about how it made him very closed, very reserved, not being able to talk about his family, not being able to make sense, develop a coherent story. What we did find, and we're going to be talking about this in later webinars, is that contact could lead to more trust and clarity around the adoption story. Seeing a birth mum for this young teenager was awkward. Her mum had schizophrenia. She had lots of problems. It wasn't easy, enjoyable contact. But she did say, well, at least I knew who she was. I could see what she was like. I didn't have to think, well, she could be like this. I didn't have to have this fantasy of wondering whether things could be different in that different family. For some people, it led to a more balanced view of their birth family as well. This adopted parent talked about how his son had learned that his birth mother had gone to prison, and he wanted to Google her and find out what happened. And he was very upset when she found out what she did. He had a strong sense of right and wrong. But this adopted mum was able to say to him, well, look, you know your nanny who he was having direct contact with. You know your uncles. You can see that you've got this very varied birth family. You've got lots of different people who have ended up living different lives. You're not necessarily going to be what your mum is. For some adoptive parents, they use contact as just an opportunity to talk more to the child, to show them that it was a topic that was always on the table. It was always something they could share with them. And this young adoptee talks about getting a birthday gift from her birth mother that was massive knickers, and realizing, because her adoptive mum talked about it, talked about why someone might send you the wrong type of present. She said, I realized she was ill. I realized that just not knowing how old I was properly, that really helped me to understand something a bit more about her. And we know, of course, that everyone is different. For some people that we've spoken to, they haven't wanted to know their birth parents. Sometimes it's because they might have memories of their early years and what happened. They might have had early contact. This person was adopted at 4 after physical and sexual abuse, and was very clear they didn't want to know their birth parents. They were at peace, they said, with themselves in adulthood. They were comfortable with the fact that they'd moved on. They were living with their adoptive parents. But as we've seen from the quotes that we've shared and from Claire's story, everyone's story is different. And we have to make sure that we are honouring whatever journey our young people might take, imagining the future self, what questions they might have, what needs and feelings might arrive. We need to make sure we're thinking about our master narratives around adoption, thinking about the complexity of their feelings that we mustn't dismiss, but we're truly tuning in to the complexity and helping them with their journey at whatever stage they have. We need to make sure we're involving adoptees like Claire and like all the people on the blog in service development and provision, sharing their stories and helping us to do things better, and retaining information, not losing information, and where we can have supportive, helpful relationships with birth families and foster families too, which I haven't had time to mention, but we know that they too can have stories, positive stories to tell about the child's past, links to things that happened in the birth family, and they may be a rich source of information as well. And above all, we need to be always preparing and supporting adoptive parents, because they're the ones who are going to be there every step of the way through the identity development of their young person. Building a secure base, but also making sure that they're helping them to feel a belonging to both families and feel able to talk about the complexity of feelings that may arise. And review the support we're giving. Remember that there are key events that can happen that can change how people feel about their adoption. The middle childhood phase, the teenage phase, moving into adulthood, becoming a parent yourself, death of adoptive parents, lots of moments that can cause a reassessment, a reevaluation of the story. And we need to make sure we have good support, good counselling, good therapy available when people want it. Sorry, I've gone slightly over time. There's very little time for questions.